On January the 11th, 1879, in an obscure corner of southern Africa, the British Empire went to war with a friendly power. Here, along 200 miles of wild and spectacularly beautiful countryside, British redcoats, together with their African and colonial allies, crossed the border into the independent Kingdom of Zululand and brought an abrupt end to half a century of peaceful coexistence. Yet just 11 days after the war began, the Zulus inflicted upon the British Army the worst defeat of the Victorian era. Over 1,700 men were killed, and a British general was chased ignominiously back to the border. British imperial pride was stung as seldom before. A war that the politicians had hoped would be over almost before it made the newspapers degenerated into a brutal slogging match which would last for 6 bloody months.
For the Zulu people, the consequences of the invasion of 1879 would be disastrous. Thousands of their young men were killed in battle, the great royal homesteads were destroyed, the political and economic structure of the kingdom was undermined, and really this paved the way for the more modern exploitation of the Zulu people into recent times.
Yet for the British, the ostensible victors, the campaign also proved disastrous. It had laid bare the cynical political ambitions which lay beneath the propaganda and pomp of empire. It left its glorious reputation in ruins. It led to the fall of a government and brought to an end a grand European dynasty. But who were the Zulu people, and what strange set of circumstances brought them into such dramatic conflict with the greatest empire the world has ever known? Zululand lies on the eastern coast of modern South Africa, sealed off from the interior by the barrier of the Kalamba Mountains, known to the first white explorers as the Drakensberg or Dragon Mountain. It is a land of broken hills and majestic rivers. The history of its human habitation is lost in the mists of time, but the enigmatic cave paintings left by the first human inhabitants, the San Bushmen, date back many thousands of years, and archaeologists believe it has been home to robust, more recognizably modern African societies for nearly 1,000 years.
The societies which gave rise to the Zulu kingdom inhabited this landscape at least as long ago as the 16th century. They were a pastoral people who were dependent upon cattle, both for food, also for utensils, but also as a means of assessing wealth and status. Politically, they were organized into chiefdoms. Although they followed basically the same culture and spoke the same language, they were politically divided. They were organized into a number of semi-independent autonomous chiefdoms who were spread over the whole of the area of modern-day KwaZulu-Natal.
Until the beginning of the 19th century, the Zulu themselves, the name means the sky above or the heavens, were just one of many such groups. Their traditional lands lay in the heart of modern Zululand, along the southern banks of the White Mfolozi River. At the end of the 18th century, however, the political geography of Southeast Africa changed with a violent fury which still bewilders historians today. The chiefdoms of North and Central Zululand were drawn into a conflict of such severity that they struggled to survive. In the end, just one chiefdom came to rule over them all, the Zulu. The triumph of the Zulu was the achievement of one of the most complex and controversial individuals in Southern African history, the warrior king, Shaka. Shaka was born about 1787, a minor and perhaps illegitimate son of the ruling chief of the Zulu, Senzangakona. His early life was marred by family conflict and by growing political tension within the Zulu world. Powerful external factors, still debated by historians today, had contrived to drive the chiefdoms of central Zululand into a conflict to control grazing land and trading routes. Small-scale violence became endemic, and Shaka, ruthless, ambitious and dynamic, was quick to spot the potential it offered. Within just a few years, Shaka had exploited his own prowess as a warrior to seize the chieftainship of the Zulu and begin a campaign of conquest which has echoed down the ages.
His story is equally wrapped round in myth and legend, both within Zulu society and within the society of the white colonial administrations that displaced it. To the Zulus themselves, he was cast in the role of a great conqueror, a great hero. He is, after all, the man who created the Zulu kingdom. To the later white administrations which succeeded the Zulus, he was portrayed as a tyrant, a ruthless murderer, someone in the mould of Pol Pot or Stalin in modern times. Undoubtedly, the truth lies somewhere in between. He was, of course, an extremely ruthless man. He was a great military commander. He could hardly have built the Zulu kingdom otherwise. Other than that, it's always going to be difficult to know exactly what sort of man Shaka was. What's rather more certain, however, is the legacy that he left to the world.
King Shaka was building the nation. If you don't like to come and join him, you see, there is no other way. It's just put you a little stick, you see, like a child. Yeah, you come to me, then you come straight to him. Yeah, not because he was intending to kill people, to kill you or to kill others. No. He was just telling them that we must make a strong nation, one nation, so that we can be a big nation. If somebody come and attack us, then we conquer him because we are together. Yeah.
Under Shaka, the Zulu emerged as the most powerful group between the mountains and the sea, dominating the country from the Black Mfolozi River in the north to the Tugela River in the south. Shaka's armies regularly raided further afield, forcing other groups to submit to the Zulu or simply to flee to escape him. Shaka owed much of his rise to a military revolution. Until the end of the 18th century, warfare in southeastern Africa was traditionally carried out by bands of youths armed with light-throwing spears.
Shaka insisted that his warriors fight with a new weapon. It was a short, strong, powerful, broad-bladed stabbing spear that was used in a very specific technique for fighting at close quarters. It was used in conjunction with a large cowhide war shield, and you would rush down on your enemy and batter him with the shield, and as he was thrown off guard, then you would thrust underneath with the killer blow from the stabbing spear.
To bring his men to close quarters as quickly and efficiently as possible, Shaka developed a new battlefield tactic known as Izimpondo Zankomo, the horns of the bull.
They just surround you as enemy. They surround an enemy. Then they put you on a center. Then they start fighting with you, so that you won't run away, because you are on a center now. They've surrounded you. Then they defeat you.
Shaka ruled for no more than 12 years, but his impact on the Zulu was extraordinary. Before Shaka, the Zulus say, there were only chiefs. Then Shaka was king. King Shaka made the Zulu powerful and wealthy. And yet, ironically, it was Shaka's very success which drew to him the seeds of his nation's destruction. Unknown to the Zulus, momentous changes were occurring 1,000 miles away at the extreme southern tip of the African continent. Already, the destiny of southern Africa no longer lay in African hands alone. In 1488, the Portuguese explorer Bartholomew Diaz became the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope, opening a major maritime highway that in time would stretch from Europe to India and the Far East. Mastery of this great sea route would dominate the global policy of the emerging empires in Europe, and in 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a way station at the Cape to service and provision passing Dutch ships.
The Dutch East India Company fairly easily displaced the rather fragile political economy of the Khoi and San people who were indigenous to the Cape. But for really quite a long time, a couple of centuries, the Dutch were not primarily interested in the interior, and their possessions at the Cape consisted of little more than a mud fort to protect it against possible invasion from the sea, and a number of farmers who grew provisions to supply the passing East India Company ships on their way to the far more profitable colonial possessions in the East Indies.
Then, in 1806, the British Empire came to the Cape, seizing it from the Dutch in one of the twists and turns of the global war against Napoleon and his allies. For the British, the Cape had little to offer beyond its strategic location. Yet with the British came new forms of administration and authority, and new waves of immigration.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The boundary of colonial southern Africa advanced inexorably into the hinterland, often driven by the restlessness of frontier farmers and frequently to the exasperation of imperial officials.
It was really against this background of the early expansion of British colonialism in southern Africa that rumours of the rise of the Zulu kingdom under King Shaka filtered down to the Cape. This was quite an alluring image to the Cape merchants, conjured up ideas of this powerful, wealthy, independent African kingdom in the interior, who could of course be exploited for ivory and furs and all the other things that the mercantile community was interested in. And it was actually in 1824 that the Cape Town merchants outfitted an expedition under the command of a ex-Royal Navy lieutenant by the name of Francis George Farewell, who sailed up what was known generally then as the wild coast of southeastern Africa to establish contact with the Zulu kingdom, specifically for commercial purposes. This was in no sense a diplomatic mission, and it was quite a dangerous and adventurous expedition. The coast itself was quite formidable and unapproachable, the breakers breaking on the open shore, the very difficult and unnavigable rivers, had all put Europeans off for a couple of centuries actually trying to make contact with the peoples of the interior.
To this unlikely beginning did all future British claims in the region belong. Then, in September 1828, Shaka was assassinated in a palace coup orchestrated by members of his own family. His rule had lasted just 12 years, but he had changed the course of Zulu history forever. He left to his heirs one of the most powerful kingdoms in southern Africa, a nation that was to prove a bastion against the steady encroachment of white rule.
The Zulus regard King Shaka as a great warrior, as a great hero. They just put him on a top mountain, if I can say that, because in Zulu we used to say Ugwelenyon. That means he's very high, you see, according to the Zulus. And he's a great ancestor in a Zulu. They believe in his spirit, that King Shaka can even now build his nation, his Zulu nation. They believe that King Shaka is busy building the nation. He won't sleep and get a rest, but he's busy fighting to unite his people. He's working for unifying the black people. That's why they've got the festival of King Shaka, where they remember King Shaka as the hero, on the 24th of September every year, each and every year. Then they go down to KwaDukuza in Stenga, near Durban, you see, on the north coast. They used to dance, they used to talk, explain about Shaka's dreams, because he dreamed that in future he's gonna build the nation. Then his dream came true now. then he's busy fighting now to remove the bad spirit among his nation, you see. That's what they believe.
It was during the reign of his successor, King Dingane, that European expansion first posed a serious threat to the security of the Zulu kingdom.
King Shaka's heir, his brother Dingane, actually one of the men who assassinated him, was faced with consolidating the Zulu kingdom in the aftermath of this period of huge expansion. He actually moved the focus of the Zulu kingdom back much more to the north, into the area that we now consider Zululand. Unfortunately, the outside world still intruded upon the history of the Zulu kingdom at this point. There were huge events going on in the Cape, far to the south. The descendants of the original Dutch settlers at the Cape had found pretty quickly that after the British took over in 1806, they didn't like British authority. There were a whole number of reasons for this. British had a much more metropolitan, much more world view than the very parochial attitude of the Dutch-speaking settlers, who of course are generally known to history as the Boers. And throughout the 1830s, many of the Boer groups who felt that they were being unsympathetically treated by this new authority began to trek away, to move away from British authority, to establish new possessions of their own in the interior. Now, at the end of 1837, they crossed over the Kahlamba Mountains, the Drakensberg Mountains, and they arrived in the territory that King Dingane claimed authority over. Very quickly, negotiations broke down. Relationships turned very sour very quickly between this new European group and the Zulus, and there was a very bloody war fought throughout 1838, which culminated really in the ascendancy of the Boers at the Battle of Rorke, or as it's generally remembered today, Blood River.
The victory at Blood River marked the final end of Zulu claims in Natal. The Boers divided the country up among themselves, seizing the best farmland and driving off the African population. Yet the prospect of Boer rule in Natal caused the British in faraway Cape Town some concern. The British had never conceded the Boer right to self-government, and they regarded them as a destabilizing force in a region already dangerously volatile. The key to their response to the Great Trek was Port Natal. Despite Farewell's efforts to secure official backing, the Crown had been reluctant to accept responsibility for the settlement. Now, however, it afforded an opportunity to check Boer progress in the region.
The British government became concerned that the Boers could open trade with rival European powers through the port. Therefore, in 1841, a small British force of 2 companies of the 27th Regiment and 2 artillery pieces were sent on a long march up the southeastern coast of Africa from Cape Colony to Natal, where they entered the area in 1842 and constructed a defensive camp. Negotiations between the Boers and the Britons quickly deteriorated, and in 1842, one evening in May, part of the British force was dispatched on a night march to attack the Boer camp. However, they were discovered in their approach, attacked by the Boers and defeated. The British were forced back on their camp, and the Boers followed up, laying siege to the British position. Fortunately for the British, 2 men, one black and one white, managed to break through the lines before they were completely encircled, and travelled some 500 miles to Grahamstown to raise the alarm. About a month later, a British warship, HMS Southampton, arrived off the coast of Port Natal, bombarded the Boer positions and raised the siege, forcing the Boers to flee from Natal. Britain now decided to take control of all of Natal and annex the whole country, adding it to its growing list of possessions in southern Africa.
In 1843, Natal officially became a British colony. The successful British takeover of Natal marked an important shift in the balance of power within the Zulu kingdom. The white presence was no longer confined to a handful of adventurers living on Zulu sufferance. Now there were officials and administrators with the whole weight of the empire to back them up. And in their wake came missionaries and respectable settlers. For the first time, the boundaries between Natal and the Zulu kingdom were officially recognized. Port Natal, renamed Durban in honor of a British governor, developed as a commercial harbour, while 50 miles inland, an impressive crop of Victorian buildings marked the British administrative capital, Pietermaritzburg.
While Europeans exercised power in Natal from 1843, they were of course hugely outnumbered by the African population which was there before them. Although Africans were taxed in an effort to make them work for white farmers, nonetheless most of the African population actually continued to live under traditional chiefs, much as they'd done for centuries. This meant that the European settler population tended to think of themselves as being small, isolated and outnumbered outposts of Christianity, very much in contemporary terms, surrounded by the savagery of Africa all around. And it led to a distinct trace of paranoia in the collective Natal settler psyche, in which they were constantly afraid of a rising from within, that the African population would rise up and attack them, and that in particular they were then also worried about this powerful, militarily strong, very robust Zulu society that was their immediate neighbour.
The emergence of white Natal had a profound effect on the Zulu kingdom. In the aftermath of the costly war with the Voortrekkers, Dingane's successor, King Mpande, had patiently rebuilt the influence of the Zulu royal house. But the Zulu kings no longer lived in a political vacuum. Dissident groups within the country often fled across the border to seek the protection of the British in Natal, while white hunting and trading parties penetrated deeper and deeper into Zulu territory. The fortunes of the two countries became increasingly and inextricably linked. By this time, the Zulus were hemmed in inland too by the creation of the Boer Republic of the Transvaal. The Zulu kings could no longer exercise their foreign policies without considering the reactions of the whites.
The implications of this changing relationship became very apparent during a particularly bloody internal succession dispute in Zululand in 1856. King Mpanda had fathered a number of sons, two of which in particular, the Princes Cetshwayo and Mbuyazi, hoped to succeed him when he passed over to the ancestral spirits in due course. Mpanda himself refused to nominate an heir, preferring to play one off against the other to ensure his own political survival. But in 1856, the two of them had accumulated sufficient followers that they actually fought one another to secure their succession for the future. Prince Mbuyazi, who was outnumbered, collected his followers together and tried to flee into Natal. This was very much an expression of the fact that Natal was now emerging as a power base in its own right on the Zulu borders. As it happened, Prince Cetshwayo caught him at the border on the banks of the Tugela River and actually destroyed Prince Mbuyazi in one of the bloodiest battles in Zulu history at a place called Ndondokuzuka. Nonetheless, it was still another 12 years before Mpanda ultimately died and Prince Cetshwayo succeeded to his birthright. And during that time, Natal remained a place of refuge for other rivals within the Zulu royal family. Rival princes, rival claimants were constantly crossing over into Natal to try and escape from Cetshwayo and to build up their own power base. And so by the time Cetshwayo became king in 1873, Natal had emerged very much as an alternative focus of authority, which potentially, right from the beginning of his reign, was a challenge to King Cetshwayo's dominance in the region.
In 1872, King Mpande died. To bolster his own position within the country, Cetshwayo invited a delegation from British Natal to attend the ceremonies. It would prove a fatal mistake. The Natal party was led by the Secretary for Native Affairs, Theophilus Shepstone. Shepstone was to have a major influence on the events which followed. The son of a Wesleyan missionary, he spoke several African languages fluently and prided himself on his understanding of the native mind. He was widely known by the African name, Somsewu, the White Father. A deep, taciturn man, his approach to African politics was Machiavellian, but his ultimate goal remained consistent: the triumph of British colonial values. The early years of Cetshwayo's reign were to prove a golden age for the Zulu people, a time of power, wealth, and independence.
In 1873, however, the Zulu kingdom was by no means as secure as it seemed. For one thing, the king was beset with all sorts of problems regarding the internal power structure, particularly during the wars against the Voortrekkers in the 1830s, again during King Mpanda's reign. Many of the regional chiefs had taken to themselves a huge degree of regional autonomy, and King Cetshwayo spent much of his reign trying to reassert the power of the state over them and to bring them back into line. On top of that perpetual struggle within the kingdom, there were of course a number of increasingly demanding, increasingly threatening disputes with his white neighbours.
The problem lay not with British Natal, but with the Boer Republic of the Transvaal inland. Here, in the high uplands along the Kalamba foothills, the border was ill-defined and the countryside sparsely populated. King Mpande had allowed Republican Boers, who were emigrating from Natal in the face of the British takeover, to establish farms there. And in the decades since, the Boers had pushed their herds further and further into Zulu territory. Their actions were widely resented in Zululand. "The Boers are like a toad," said one Zulu, "which hops and hops without being noticed until it has hopped right into the center of your hut." Throughout this dispute, Cetshwayo felt confident of the support of his ally in Natal, Shepstone. Then, with breathtaking suddenness, the political geography changed, and with it, Shepstone's attitude towards the Zulus. In 1868, diamonds had been discovered north of the Cape Colony. By an adroit redrawing of the map, the British had taken control of the area, and diggers flocked in, creating the boom town of Kimberley and altering forever the economy of southern Africa. But by the middle of the 1870s, the British were increasingly confident of their ability to impose their will on the world. Queen Victoria was at the height of her power and prestige, and British possessions stretched around the globe. The British Army was one of the most experienced in the world, and was armed with the best weapons the Industrial Revolution could provide. In London, imperial theorists were increasingly prepared to grasp the nettle of their more troublesome dependencies. The solution proposed for southern Africa was a policy called confederation. The disparate groups who lived there would be brought loosely under British control. The first piece in the fractured political jigsaw to be painted over red was the Transvaal Republic. Under the pretext of offering military protection, the British stepped in. Troops were marched to Pretoria, and the Transvaal simply annexed to the British Crown. For the Zulus, the annexation of the Transvaal had unforeseen repercussions. The man appointed to head the new Transvaal government was none other than Theophilus Shepstone. But if Cetshwayo expected his old friend to resolve the border dispute, however, he was mistaken. With the frontier farmers now under British protection, Shepstone took their part. It was a change Cetshwayo regarded as little more than a personal betrayal. Against this background of deteriorating Anglo-Zulu relations, a new figure arrived in South Africa to take charge of British affairs.
Well, the war against Zululand really was, in fact, part of the move towards confederation, to actually bring together these South African states and destroy the independent African ones. Part of this was the British civilizing mission, if you like, where labor would be unlocked, people would be Christianized and become good, useful, productive laborers. So part of the idea of that as well, of course, was that Zululand would be brought into this developing capitalist economy in the interest of civilization and Christianity. So you've got strategic, political, economic, if you like, Christian reasons for doing all of it. And Sir Bartle Frere was sent out to South Africa as High Commissioner to get this process going. And this was his job. He pushed the process the whole way through. He was determined that a short, sharp war was all that you'd need against the Zulu, that a quick campaign would knock the Zulu out, and then you could bring the whole confederation system into being. He was mistaken, of course. The war was a disaster, but that was the idea.
Within months of his arrival, Frere had come to see the Zulu kingdom as a block on the road to confederation. A commission met in March 1878 on neutral territory at an old trading post on the border called Rorke's Drift. For several weeks it painstakingly sifted the evidence from both sides and then dropped its bombshell. It found entirely in favor of the Zulu claims. The findings were a setback to Frere, but while he considered his options, the Zulus played into his hands.
In July 1878, two wives of an important border chieftain by the name of Sehayo fled across from the Zulu side across the Mzinyati River and moved in actually with their lovers on the Natal bank. Now, according to Zulu custom, this was something of a heinous crime. It involved a great deal of embarrassment to a man who had huge status and importance on the Zulu side of the border. And although Sehayo himself didn't intend to do anything about it, his family were outraged. And indeed, when Sehayo himself was away attending the king, his senior son, a man by the name of Mehloka Zulu, who was quite a prominent warrior, he was a commander in the Ngobo Makosi regiment, a young man known as being fairly forceful and fairly aggressive, actually took the law into his own hands. And with a small armed force, about 200 men, Mehloka Zulu crossed over the river into British territory. They surrounded the huts where these women had taken refuge, and they dragged them back to the Zulu side of the border. And there, in accordance with Zulu law, these two women were put to death. They were actually shot, as Natal Settler Society noted with a certain amount of outrage, within sight of the mission station at Rorke's Drift.
While settler opinion in Natal considered this apparent outrage, a second incident occurred. Africans living on the outskirts of Lundberg in the disputed territory were raided and their cattle stolen.
The raiders were followers of Mbeleni wa Mswati, who actually wasn't a Zulu. He was actually an exiled Swazi prince. He was one of the sons of the Swazi king Sobhuza, and he tried to succeed to the Swazi throne, but actually had failed and had been chased out. And he'd come to King Cetshwayo and given his allegiance to King Cetshwayo. And Cetshwayo had then settled him up on the northern borders of Zululand, in the region of the Pongola River. But Mbeleni was largely destitute. He had no followers and he had no cattle, and he needed to build these up. And he subsisted largely by banditry up on the northern border. This was an area that was a long way from the centres of any kind of authority, African or European. And Mbeleni's followers had raided white farms in the vicinity of Lüneburg, actually, and killed a number of the African farm workers. Now, of course, coming so soon upon the incident with the followers of Sehayo, this seemed to confirm Sir Bartle Frere's feelings that the Zulus were a very dangerous and difficult neighbour, that you couldn't peacefully live with these people, and certainly that any expansion of British authority really would have to face up to the challenge posed by these rather difficult neighbours.
Frere's response was decisive. He invited Cetshwayo to send representatives to a meeting to be held on the banks of the Tugela River to hear the long-awaited Boundary Commission report and, ominously, to discuss other matters. The meeting took place on the 11th of December 1878. Beneath a large tarpaulin spread across the tree, Frere's agents read out the Commission's report, while the Zulu party squatted in the shade opposite them. Then came the sting in the tail. Tagged on to the Boundary Award were a series of demands which amounted to little more than an ultimatum. On the grounds that Shepstone's presence at Cetshwayo's invitation 5 years before had given the British a right to intervene in Zulu affairs, Frere demanded not only the surrender of both Mbeleni and Mehloka Zulu, but that Cetshwayo should disband the Zulu army. The Zulu representatives were astonished. Cetshwayo was given 30 days to comply, failing which he would find himself at war with the British Empire.
Of course, if the Zulus did choose to comply, then Frere would have achieved his political objective anyway. He didn't expect that to happen. He expected that British troops would cross into Zululand and force British will upon the Zulu people. He expected also, of course, that it would be a quick and easy campaign. In fact, it didn't actually work out like that. And really, this tree behind me marks the point at which the tragedy of the Anglo-Zulu War and the subsequent destruction of Zulu independence really begins.
Frere's ultimatum begged a clear military question. The man who would have charge of the coming war was the senior British officer in southern Africa, Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford.
Lord Chelmsford was then in his early 50s. He was a professional career soldier who'd cut his military teeth in the Crimean War and the Indian Mutiny. He was very much a product of his time and class, very much the Victorian gentleman, quiet, aloof, known for being polite. Now, he'd recently fought a campaign down on the Eastern Cape frontier, where he'd brought a very messy little campaign against the Amaxhosa people to a successful conclusion. And he came into Zululand fresh with the confidence that that had given him.
But this was an ambitious plan.
In order to operate in that environment, the British Army would have to take all of its supplies, ammunition, tents, food, actually with it into the field. So any advancing column would need a huge supply train to support it. The Zulus, of course, would need none. Any war of manoeuvre, therefore, would be essentially in favour of the Zulus. Because they lived off the land, because they were used to moving in that environment, they could move much more quickly than the British were able to do. Lord Chelmsford therefore needed to come up with a strategy that would bring the Zulus to battle as quickly as possible. And he decided to invade in 5 separate columns, the idea being that he would then pin the Zulus down and make them fight. "My one fear," he said to somebody, "is that I won't get them to fight. I must drive them into a corner and make them fight."
This required a large troop commitment and extensive logistical backup. There were simply not enough troops available in South Africa, and the British government, already committed to a war in Afghanistan, was reluctant to send more. Moreover, each column would require hundreds of wagons to carry equipment and supplies, and Chelmsford's agents soon exhausted the colonial market. Chelmsford's solution was to revise his invasion plan. He reduced the number of offensive columns to 3, while the other 2 were reduced in size and given a largely defensive role. Throughout the second half of January, British troops were assembled along the border.
"We shall have to put the redcoats forward to bear the first brunt, and then I think the natives will go in. I'm inclined to think that the first experience of the power of the Martini Henry rifle will be such a surprise to the Zulus that they will not be formidable after the first effort."
There were too few redcoats to wage the war alone, however, and Chelmsford called upon the resources of Natal to help him.
One of the major problems facing Chelmsford as he formed his army for the invasion of Zululand was a total lack of cavalry. Therefore, Chelmsford requested the use of the Natal Volunteer Corps. These were small units, numbering perhaps only 35 to 60 men, who recruited on a part-time basis from the white settler community to form a defence force for Natal. Although recruited generally from the flotsam and jetsam of colonial life, this much-needed source of manpower helped Chelmsford build up his very limited cavalry force.
Yet the settlers weren't the only untapped military resource in Natal. Many of the Africans living in the colony had a history of antagonism towards the Zulu royal house. While the military build-up on the borders continued, the Zulu movements could only be guessed at. On the 11th of January 1879, as Frere intended it should, the Anglo-Zulu War began.
The British forces are crossing into Zululand to exact from Cetshwayo reparation for violations of British territory committed by the sons of Hayo and others, and to enforce compliance with the promises made by Cetshwayo at his coronation for the better government of his people. The British government has no quarrel with the Zulu people. All Zulus who come in unarmed or who lay down their arms will be provided for, till the troubles of their country are over, and will then, if they please, be allowed to return to their own land. But all who do not so submit will be dealt with as enemies.
The coastal column, the right flank of Chelmsford's 3-pronged attack, was commanded by Colonel Charles Knight Pearson, a competent officer who nonetheless had last seen action in the Crimea over 20 years before. Pearson's first objective was an abandoned Norwegian mission station known as Eshowe, which lay more than 30 miles from the border by an overgrown wagon track. European buildings were rare in Zululand, and Chelmsford planned to use them as supply depots. Pearson's men advanced through an empty landscape. The Zulu homesteads along the road were deserted and silent. Now and then, British scouts had seen Zulu scouts watching from distant hilltops, but they had melted away as the troops approached. The whereabouts of the famous Zulu army remained unknown.
The response of the Zulu High Command to the British invasion was very carefully considered. On the 17th, the Great Zulu Army left Ondini and the cluster of royal homesteads there, striking out towards the British invaders. It was some 28,000 strong. Most of the army marched westwards towards the direction that the centre column was coming from Rorke's Drift. But a day away from Ulundi, about 3,500 men peeled off under the command of a well-known Induna by the name of Godide Kaindlela, and struck down towards the coast to support the elements which had been left in that area to harass Colonel Pearson's column.
On the 21st of January, Pearson passed close to a Zulu royal homestead known as Kwagingindlovu. His scouts reported seeing a Zulu force nearby, but when he sent a party to investigate, they found the homestead deserted. On the 22nd, the column advanced again, following a track which took them across the Inyezane River and up through the hills below Eshawi.
I'm standing on the banks of the Inyezane River. At about 8 o'clock on the morning of the 22nd of January, Colonel Pearson's column crossed the river here, intending to follow a track which led up through these hills on the way to Eshawi. The area seemed to be free of Zulus, but just as Pearson's wagons started to get across the river, they noticed some Zulu scouts on the top of that hill behind me, the higher hill up there on the right. Pearson sent forward a detachment of the Natal native contingent under the command of a Captain Hart to drive the Zulu scouts off. And they crossed the ground behind me, advancing up the hill, following the Zulus who disappeared over the line of the hill behind them. Then, just as they got halfway up the hill, there was a sudden shout of "Usutu!" and Zulus rose up out of the grass and rushed down to attack Pearson's column.
Pearson hurried forward his 2 field guns and the men of the Buffs, who had just crossed the river. There was a slight rise across the road, opposite the Zulu position, and here he formed his battle line.
As the British responded to the sudden appearance of the Zulus, the true strength of their force became apparent. Hart's forward movement with his detachment of the Natal native contingent had stumbled into the leading elements of the Zulu left horn and provoked the attack. With no further need for concealment, the main force of the Zulu left horn now began to stream down a long spur of Womban Hill, intending to work around the right of the British line and cut across the rear of the leading section of Pearson's column as it crossed the river. A heavy concentration of British fire followed this sweeping movement.
While the Zulu left attempted to surround the column, the centre took possession of a Zulu homestead which lay beside the road at the head of the ridge. From this position, the warriors could fire down into Pearson's line, drawn up below them. Hart realized the importance of this position. Finding his African troops were reluctant to follow him, he collected a group of NCOs from the contingent.
We advanced steadily against the kraal by the main road. The officers, except myself, dismounted, and the little party used their rifles well and did as I directed, halting to fire and advancing again when I gave the word. Thus we approached the kraal. It was a small kraal, but it occupied a very advantageous position. The enemy covered by it could fire a quarter of a mile down the road. As we approached, the enemy retreated from the kraal, except a few men who remained almost until we reached it. Not one of our party was killed or wounded in taking the kraal, but several dead bodies of the enemy showed that our fire had been more effective. I at once set the kraal on fire, and as the flames shot high in the air, in consuming the huts, we gave a loud cheer altogether.
Hart's sortie had cleared the road, while the advance of the Zulu left had ground to a halt in the face of the heavy fire from the infantry. The battle lasted perhaps an hour and a half, and the British had been surprised and impressed by the determination of the Zulu attacks. As many as 400 dead Zulus lay in a great arc beyond the road. and hundreds more had been wounded. By contrast, the British had suffered very little. Captain Hart realized the outcome of the battle had depended more than anything upon the British advantage in technology.
The Zulus fought well, showing judgment and courage quite equal to their enemy. But although they outnumbered us greatly, they could not hold the ground against our artillery and superior rifles. We had the best rifles in the world. They, for the most part, merely muskets, weapons of the past.
Pearson had achieved his first objective. According to Chelmsford's original invasion plan, he was supposed to fortify the post, to use it as a supply depot, and await further instructions from Lord Chelmsford. The troops immediately set about securing the position, clearing the bush around the buildings, and cutting down the missionaries' fruit orchard to clear the field of fire. A defensive perimeter was thrown up around the post. The mood in the column was relaxed and confident. The troops had had their baptism of fire and had been victorious. No one seriously considered that the Zulus could regroup and attack again. Then, on the 25th, the mood within the camp suddenly changed. That morning, colonial troops on outpost duty heard the Zulus in the countryside beyond passing a message from hilltop to hilltop. There had been a great battle, the Zulus shouted, and an army of white men had been utterly destroyed. It was the first hint the garrison of Ashawi had that the troops of Lord Chelmsford's column had suffered a catastrophic defeat.